Joey Merlino, feared, flamboyant, and forever controversial. In today's video, we're peeling back the layers on the man who once ruled the streets of South Philly with an iron fist. From his brutal mob wars with Sicilian boss John Stanfa to his headline-grabbing criminal cases, Merlino has always been a lightning rod for media attention. We'll take you through his early days, the violent power struggles, and his audacious stunts that earned him the nickname John Gotti of Passyunk Avenue. Joey Merlino's story begins in Philadelphia, where he was born on March 16, 1962. His upbringing was anything but ordinary. His father, Salvatore "Chucky" Merlino, and his uncle Lawrence were both key players in the notoriously violent mob crew led by Nicky Scarfo, a brutal crime boss who instilled fear throughout the Philadelphia underworld. When Scarfo seized control of the mafia in 1981, he appointed Chucky as his underboss, and Lawrence was elevated to the position of captain. Scarfo's leadership was marked by extreme paranoia, resulting in the execution of many of his own men. Even Chucky wasn't immune to Scarfo's ruthless tendencies. He was demoted to the rank of soldier, reportedly due to his excessive drinking habits. Meanwhile, Joey, who earned the nickname Skinny Joey, was already making a name for himself as a rebellious and trouble-prone youth. His early criminal activities included a number of serious offenses, such as aggravated assault for stabbing two men during an altercation at the Jersey Shore. Joey's gang of young, Italian-American misfits, known as the Young Turks, was composed of the sons and nephews of incarcerated mobsters. Among his close associates were Michael Ciancaglini, Stephen Mazzone, Salvatore Scafidi, Sonny Valenti, George Borghese, and Marty Angelina, many of whom remain connected to organized crime in Philadelphia today. The bloody reign of Nicky Scarfo began to unravel in 1987 when he was sentenced to life in prison for a range of charges including racketeering and murder. Joey's father, Chucky, also faced a lengthy prison term, which would have kept him locked up until 2016, though he passed away in 2012 before he could complete his sentence. Following Scarfo's imprisonment, he attempted to keep control of his criminal empire through his son, Nicky Jr. However, Joey Merlino and his ambitious crew had no interest in taking orders from the younger Scarfo. In a dramatic turn of events, on Halloween night in 1989, a man entered a South Philly Italian restaurant and unleashed a barrage of bullets from a MAC-10 submachine gun, targeting Nicky Jr. Remarkably, despite being shot multiple times, Nicky Jr. survived the assassination attempt. It has long been speculated that Joey Merlino orchestrated this audacious attack, signaling to the imprisoned Scarfo that his reign was officially over. Not long after, Merlino himself was convicted for his involvement in an armored car robbery and was sentenced to several years in prison. In the spring of 1992, Joey Merlino found himself back on the streets after completing his prison sentence. But a lot had changed during his time behind bars. The powerful New York crime families had decided to install a new boss in Philadelphia, Sicilian-born mobster John Stanfa. To Merlino and his crew of so-called Young Turks, this was a bitter pill to swallow. They had no intention of following orders from what they saw as an outsider, someone they derisively referred to as a ciggy and greaseball. They felt that the leadership of the Philadelphia Mafia should remain in the hands of the local, Italian-American street soldiers like themselves, who had earned their stripes in the rough-and-tumble neighborhoods of South Philly. Far from respecting the new leadership, the Young Turks actively resisted it. They began muscling in on local bookies and extorting other criminals, but unlike traditional mobsters, they refused to pay a cut to the newly appointed boss. This blatant disrespect was more than just a financial snub, it was a declaration of defiance. Meanwhile, Merlino and his crew gained a reputation not just for their strong-arm tactics, but for their wild and flashy lifestyles. They were known to throw extravagant parties, dressed in expensive designer clothes, and were often seen stirring up violence in the middle of nightclubs. Their ostentatious behavior clashed sharply with the old-school mafia ethos, where discretion and modesty were prized above all. Stanfa, the old-world Sicilian don, was absolutely outraged by what he saw as their arrogant, disrespectful antics, going so far as to call them cuckolds, disgusted by their obsession with flash and spectacle. Tensions within the Philadelphia Mafia reached a boiling point as these two factions, the traditionalists led by Stanfa and the rebellious Young Turks led by Merlino, grew increasingly hostile toward each other. However, Stanfa, in a calculated move, believed he could bring Merlino and his crew back in line by officially inducting them into the Mafia. In September 1992, Joey Merlino and his closest ally, Michael Ciancaglini, were formally initiated into the Philadelphia crime family in a traditional mafia-making ceremony. Stanfa had even promoted Michael's brother, Joey Ciancaglini, to the rank of underboss, hoping this gesture would smooth over the division between the older and younger factions of the organization. The logic was simple: as made men, Merlino and his crew would be more accountable. They would have to obey mafia rules, including attending meetings when ordered, a situation that would give Stanfa a chance to monitor them more closely or even set them up for elimination. However, this plan backfired spectacularly. Rather than toning down their behavior, Merlino and his gang became even more brazen. Joey, in particular, seemed determined to live like a celebrity, frequenting upscale nightclubs, downing champagne in high-end bars, and flaunting his wealth at every opportunity. To a traditional mafioso like Stanfa, who valued discretion and staying under the radar, this kind of behavior was utterly unacceptable. Merlino's refusal to pay off his gambling debts to local bookies only added fuel to the fire. The increasing tensions finally reached their breaking point on March 2, 1993, when Merlino and his crew decided to strike first. In a shocking turn of events, the Young Turks launched an all-out assault on Stanfa's regime. Joey Ciancaglini, who had been promoted to underboss by Stanfa in a bid to unite the family, became the target of a brutal assassination attempt. Ciancaglini was running a luncheonette in South Philly, Warfield Lunch and Breakfast Express, which he used as a front for his criminal operations. Arriving early one morning to open up shop, Ciancaglini had no idea that his time was running out. A car pulled up, and 3 gunmen jumped out, storming into the luncheonette with guns blazing. The assailants fired dozens of rounds at the unsuspecting underboss, leaving him for dead. Remarkably, despite the onslaught of bullets, Ciancaglini survived the attack, though he would never fully recover from his injuries. The FBI, who had been closely monitoring the luncheonette, caught the entire ambush on camera, adding even more intrigue to the brazen attempt on Ciancaglini's life. But the most shocking detail of all was the involvement of his own brother, Michael, who had participated in the assassination attempt. This act of betrayal only served to highlight just how fractured and volatile the Philadelphia Mafia had become under Stanfa's rule. The lines of loyalty were blurred, and the battle for control of the family was far from over. The battle for control of the Philadelphia Mafia had now erupted into full-scale warfare, with both sides plotting to eliminate the other. With tensions soaring, John Stanfa decided to take matters into his own hands by planning a lethal ambush for Joey Merlino and his Young Turks. He invited them to what was supposed to be a peaceful sit-down, a hallmark of old mafia diplomacy, but Merlino and his crew, having become wise to Stanfa's tactics, sensed that this was no ordinary meeting. They suspected it was a setup designed to lure them into a deadly trap. Instead of walking into what could have been their demise, they wisely chose to skip the meeting altogether. Stanfa, frustrated but undeterred, soon found another way to strike at his younger rivals. Stanfa's luck improved when he recruited a low-level criminal named John Vesey, a man with little to lose and everything to gain from proving his loyalty to the Mafia. On August 5, 1993, a blisteringly hot summer afternoon in South Philadelphia, Merlino and his trusted friend and lieutenant, Michael Ciancaglini, were leaving a mob-run social club. They had no idea that Vesey, along with another aspiring gangster, Phil Coletti, had been lurking nearby, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. As Merlino and Ciancaglini walked down the street, Vesey and Coletti drove past them, opening fire without hesitation. In a hail of bullets, Ciancaglini was killed, while Merlino was seriously wounded but managed to survive. The audacious hit shocked the criminal underworld, and many believed that Merlino's days were now numbered, his once powerful crew weakened by the loss of Acquittal. But if anyone thought that Joey Merlino would fade quietly into the shadows after the death of his closest ally, they were sorely mistaken. Not only was he determined to avenge Acquittal, but he was also ready to send a message to Stanfa that his reign was far from secure. Just a few weeks later, at the end of August, Merlino orchestrated a stunning counterattack. As John Stanfa was being driven to work on a busy interstate highway by his chauffeur, Freddie Aldrich, with Stanfa's son, Joe, seated in the back, a van pulled up alongside them. The van had been specially outfitted with holes cut into its sides, allowing the gunman inside to fire at will. A sudden barrage of bullets tore into Stanfa's car, wounding his son, Joe. In a desperate attempt to save their lives, Aldrich rammed the van off the road and sped to the nearest hospital, where Joe Stanfa was treated for his injuries. This brazen and reckless attempt to take out Stanfa in broad daylight, on a public highway no less, sent shockwaves through Philadelphia. Even the FBI, which had been keeping tabs on Merlino and his crew, was outraged by the sheer audacity of the attack. The fact that such a violent and public assassination attempt had been carried out in the middle of a busy expressway, with countless innocent commuters at risk, infuriated law enforcement. Merlino, now squarely in the FBI's crosshairs, was quickly arrested for a parole violation, a move that may have saved his life in the long run by removing him from the escalating mob war. Still, with his defiant nature, it was doubtful that prison would keep Merlino sidelined for long. Meanwhile, the FBI had been working tirelessly to dismantle Stanfa's organization. They had placed the mob boss under intense surveillance, even managing to bug his lawyer's office and other places where he conducted his criminal business. As 1993 progressed, Stanfa's grip on power began to weaken. The authorities soon charged him with a litany of serious crimes, including racketeering and murder, effectively sealing his fate. To make matters worse for Stanfa, some of his most trusted men turned against him, providing the evidence necessary to convict him. In 1995, John Stanfa was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole, marking the end of his disastrous reign. While Stanfa was being taken down, Joey Merlino was busy making powerful connections behind bars. During his time in prison, he crossed paths with Ralph Natale, a Bruno-era associate who had been locked up since 1978. Natale was nearly twice Merlino's age and had once been the head of a bartenders' union in Atlantic City. During their prison conversations, the two men began hatching a bold plan to seize control of the Philadelphia Mafia once and for all. Their strategy was unconventional, to say the least. Natale, despite never having been formally made into the Mafia, would take over as the new boss. Meanwhile, Merlino, ever the strategist, saw himself stepping into the underboss role, believing this would attract less attention from law enforcement. Though it may seem strange that a non-made man like Natale would be considered for the top spot, he did have valuable contacts in New York and claimed to have the backing of key figures. Some reports even suggested that Merlino, during his time in prison, had secured the approval of one of the New York Mafia families to move forward with the takeover. However, this theory remained speculative, as the 5 New York families had their hands full with their own problems and likely had little interest in getting involved with Philadelphia's chaotic underworld. Nonetheless, Natale boasted that he had the support of all the made men in Allenwood, the federal prison where he and Merlino had served their time together. With Natale poised to take the reins and Merlino eager to play a central role, a new era for the Philly mob was about to begin. In 1994, following their release from prison, Joey Merlino and Ralph Natale finally had their chance to put their ambitious plan into motion. Their goal? To seize control of the shattered remnants of the Philadelphia Mafia and elevate themselves to the top of its hierarchy. Natale, who had been incarcerated since 1978 and had never been formally initiated into the Mafia, was quickly inducted by Merlino in a ceremony that took place just a few weeks after their release. What came next was a bold and highly unconventional move. Merlino, eager to stay out of the law enforcement spotlight, promoted Natale to the position of boss, making him the public face of the organization while Merlino acted as the real power behind the scenes. This strategy, they hoped, would shield Joey from the prying eyes of the FBI, leaving Natale to handle the heat. But if the plan was for Merlino to remain low profile, the flamboyant skinny Joey had other ideas. He embraced the limelight like a seasoned celebrity, hosting Thanksgiving parties for underprivileged children in his South Philly neighborhood. The events became media spectacles, with local news stations invited to cover the festivities, showing Merlino handing out turkeys and even throwing cash to the crowd. This ostentatious display of generosity earned him the nickname the John Gotti of Passyunk Avenue, a nod to his resemblance in style to the flashy and equally media-hungry Gambino crime boss, John Gotti. But while these stunts boosted Merlino's public image, they only deepened law enforcement's resolve to bring him down. The FBI and local police were infuriated by his brazen behavior and were determined to see the young gangster back behind bars. Meanwhile, Merlino continued to rake in profits through traditional mafia operations, such as illegal gambling, loan sharking, protection rackets, and dealing in stolen goods. His nominal boss, Ralph Natale, was keen on expanding their criminal empire into the lucrative drug trade. Natale, despite his background as a former union leader, had extensive experience in the methamphetamine business and saw an opportunity to dominate the drug markets in Philadelphia. Together, the two men were determined to restore the mafia's dominance over the streets. One of the key tactics used by the mafia to maintain control over South Philly was the imposition of a street tax, a fee that all non-mob criminals, bookies, and drug dealers were forced to pay for the privilege of operating on mafia turf. This system had been ruthlessly enforced by Nicky Scarfo during his reign in the 1980s, and now Merlino believed it was his turn to collect. He ordered his men to shake down any criminal operating in South Philly, demanding a cut of their illicit earnings, including those involved in the drug trade. This aggressive approach soon led to trouble. One night, at a suburban bar frequented by mobsters, a confrontation broke out between some of Merlino's men and a local drug dealer named Tura. Tura, who was part of an Italian-American street gang heavily involved in South Philly's drug trade, was viciously beaten by Merlino's crew, leaving him hospitalized. Infuriated by both the attack and Merlino's demands for a slice of his drug profits, Tura, a violent figure with a history of murder, vowed revenge. He set his sights on Skinny Joey, determined to eliminate him and take over his criminal operations. Tura's rage fueled a plot by his family and their gang to murder Merlino. At one of their meetings, they even boasted about blowing him up with a grenade, convinced that eliminating him would allow them to seize control of South Philadelphia's underworld. But before they could execute their plan, the entire Tura gang was taken down by law enforcement. In August 1997, Tura and several members of his gang were indicted on a slew of charges, including the conspiracy to kill Joey Merlino. As Tura awaited trial in a New York jail, he was found dead in his cell just after New Year's, hanging from a bedsheet tied around his neck. While his death was officially ruled a suicide, there has always been speculation about whether it was truly self-inflicted or if someone else had a hand in it. The Tura family's downfall didn't end there. A few months later, Lewis's father, Anthony Tura, along with his brother, uncle, and other gang members, went to trial. But just as the trial was getting underway, a mob hitman gunned down Anthony Tura on the front steps of his South Philadelphia home, just blocks from Passyunk Avenue. The assassination sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. While Merlino was acquitted of any involvement in the murder, rumors swirled that Ralph Natale might have had more motivation to see Anthony Tura dead than Joey did. Regardless of who ordered the hit, it was clear that the Philly Mafia under Merlino and Natale's leadership had little tolerance for threats to their control, and they were willing to go to any lengths to maintain their grip on power. One of the many mobsters who found themselves on the wrong side of Joey Merlino and Ralph Natale's ruthless leadership was Joe Sodano, a veteran soldier in the Philadelphia Mafia with deep ties to Newark, New Jersey. For decades, the Philadelphia crime family had maintained a small but profitable crew in Newark, an operation that had been running for over half a century. Sodano had risen through the ranks in the 1980s under the bloody reign of Nicky Scarfo, being made into La Cosa Nostra in 1982 as a reward for his considerable earning power. He managed an incredibly lucrative bookmaking operation, which brought in substantial profits for both himself and Scarfo. But when Scarfo was imprisoned, Sodano saw an opportunity to break away from Philadelphia's control. He stopped sending up tribute payments and began cozying up to the New York mafia families, hoping to align himself with more powerful figures across state lines. However, when John Stanfa was appointed boss of the Philly Mafia by the New York families, Sodano begrudgingly fell back into line, resuming his tribute payments and becoming one of Stanfa's most trusted soldiers. For a time, he enjoyed relative stability under Stanfa's rule. But when the power shifted once again, with Merlino and Natale taking control, the expectations changed. The new bosses, as per mafia tradition, demanded the same tribute that Sodano had previously sent up to Scarfo and Stanfa. But Sodano, clearly not respecting the brash, young leadership now running Philadelphia, flatly refused to pay. Worse still, he snubbed their invitation to a sit-down, a blatant sign of disrespect and mob culture. Refusing to pay dues or attend a summoned meeting was essentially a death sentence in the world of La Cosa Nostra. Seeing Sodano's disobedience as an affront that couldn't go unpunished, Joey Merlino quickly handed down the contract for his murder to Pete the Crumb Caprio, a trusted soldier who would later flip and cooperate with authorities. The hit was ultimately carried out by a low-level associate named Phil Casale, a man with a sordid past as a convicted child molester. On December 10, 1996, Joe Sodano's lifeless body was discovered by police in the front seat of his van, parked outside an apartment complex in Newark. He had been shot twice in the head, a grim reminder of what happens to those who defy the mafia's demands. By the late 1990s, however, cracks were beginning to form in the once solid partnership between Joey Merlino and Ralph Natale. Although Merlino had strategically placed Natale as the front boss to divert attention from himself, Natale increasingly began acting as though he wielded real power within the organization. For Merlino, who saw himself as the true leader, this growing assertiveness became a source of tension. Natale, whose background as a Bruno-era associate was steeped in drug dealing, continued to make moves in the narcotics trade, forming connections with various drug traffickers. Meanwhile, Joey Merlino preferred to focus on more traditional mafia rackets like gambling, loan sharking, and extortion, eager to maintain control over those operations. Adding to the friction between them was Natale's prior relationship with the Tura family, the same violent drug-dealing clan that had come dangerously close to waging war with Merlino just a few years earlier. Tensions between the two mob leaders were only exacerbated by Merlino's high-profile lifestyle. His flamboyant public persona, complete with media appearances and lavish parties, earned him both admirers and enemies, with law enforcement becoming increasingly determined to bring down the self-styled celebrity gangster. The FBI and other agencies were particularly focused on his and Natale's involvement in drug trafficking, a volatile element that heightened their scrutiny. By June 1998, the strained partnership reached a breaking point. Natale was sent back to prison for violating parole after authorities proved that he had continued his involvement with mafia activities. With Natale out of the picture, Joey Merlino officially declared himself the boss of the Philadelphia Mafia, informing his captains that Natale was no longer a factor. However, the split was not without its repercussions. Natale, feeling betrayed and abandoned by Merlino, who he claimed had refused to financially support his family during his imprisonment, decided to turn against the very organization he had helped lead. In a stunning move, Natale began cooperating with federal prosecutors, spilling everything he knew about the inner workings of the Philadelphia Mafia, its operations, and its leadership. The betrayal was devastating for Merlino and his crew. Skinny Joey's days as a free man were now numbered. He managed to hold on for another year, but by June 1999, the law finally caught up with him. He was arrested and indicted, along with several of his closest allies, Steve Mazzone, John Ciancaglini, Marty Angelina, and George Borghese, on serious charges that included conspiring with the Boston Mafia to distribute large quantities of cocaine. Prosecutors alleged that Merlino received a hefty payout of $6,000 for every kilo of cocaine that changed hands. The indictment was a crushing blow to Merlino's criminal empire and marked the beginning of the end for his reign over the Philadelphia Mafia. Ralph Natale's testimony posed a serious threat to Joey Merlino's future as a free man. Natale, once the acting boss of the Philadelphia Mafia and Merlino's former ally, turned government witness, unraveling his decades-long involvement in organized crime. From his early days as a union boss protected by Angelo Bruno in the 1970s to his tenure as the figurehead boss of the Philly Mafia in the 1990s, Natale didn't hold back in detailing the criminal empire he had helped build. His testimony aimed to put the flashy young gangster, Skinny Joey, behind bars for good. But as Merlino sat in prison awaiting trial, he wasn't about to let his grip on the Philadelphia underworld slip. In a calculated move to ensure his criminal operations continued smoothly, he appointed a low-profile but trusted mobster, Joe Legambi, as acting boss in his absence. Joe Legambi, also known as Uncle Joe, was an old associate of Merlino's father, Chucky. A seasoned mobster with deep roots in South Philly, Legambi had been involved in sports betting for years. He had been made into La Cosa Nostra by Nicky Scarfo after participating in the infamous hit on Frankie Flowers, a former associate of Angelo Bruno who had refused to pay tribute to Scarfo. Legambi, convicted for the murder in 1987 alongside Scarfo, was later acquitted a decade later and quietly returned to South Philadelphia, slipping into Skinny Joey's circle. Known for his low-key style, Legambi was the opposite of Merlino's flamboyant persona. He preferred to operate in the shadows, avoiding the media attention and law enforcement scrutiny that seemed to follow Merlino wherever he went. Despite his efforts to stay under the radar, Legambi's name became connected to darker rumors. He was suspected of ordering the murder of former consigliere Ron Turkey, who had once served as Ralph Natale's right-hand man. Turkey's murder was allegedly a message to Natale, a warning to keep quiet about the mafia's inner workings. The plot thickened when it was revealed that Turkey had reportedly paid $10,000 to a high-ranking member of the Gambino family in New York to replace Merlino as boss after his indictment in 1999. While law enforcement and the media speculated that Legambi had ordered the hit, they lacked the proof to officially pin the crime on him, leaving the mystery unresolved. In the meantime, Merlino's legal troubles continued to mount. In April 2000, more charges were added to his already severe racketeering indictment. The most damning accusations included involvement in 3 murders, those of Newark mobster Joe Sodano, drug dealer Anthony Tura, and others tied to violent underworld conflicts. These charges meant that Skinny Joey and his crew were staring down the possibility of life sentences if convicted. The trial, which captivated the attention of local media, wouldn't begin until April 2001. It was a high-stakes affair for Merlino, who now had to contend with Ralph Natale testifying against him, along with a slew of other mobsters turned informants eager to take the stand. But the government's case was far from airtight. Ralph Natale, a man with a long and sordid history of lying, cheating, and killing, was hardly the most reliable witness. His credibility was a major issue, as he took the opportunity to embellish his role in the Philly Mafia while deflecting blame for the most heinous crimes onto Joey Merlino. Natale basked in the spotlight, painting himself as a kingpin while distancing himself from the more violent acts he had surely been involved in. The problem for prosecutors, though, was convincing the jury that this convicted murderer and self-proclaimed mob boss was telling the truth. The jury, it seemed, had a hard time swallowing Natale's narrative. On July 2, 2001, the jury delivered its verdict. Merlino and his crew were acquitted of the 3 murder charges that had hung over their heads, sparing them from life behind bars. It was a significant victory for the Philadelphia mob boss, but the celebration was short-lived. The jury did find Merlino guilty on a host of other charges, including racketeering, extortion, illegal bookmaking, and receiving stolen property. The crimes, while less serious than murder, still carried heavy penalties. In December of that year, Skinny Joey stood before the judge and was handed a 14-year federal prison sentence. True to his resilient nature, Merlino reportedly quipped, "Ain't bad, better than the death penalty," a remark that underscored his ability to find light even in the darkest of moments. Indeed, for Merlino, things could have been far worse. He avoided a life sentence and was given the opportunity for parole by 2011, when he would still be relatively young at 49 years old. While law enforcement had managed to knock the brash young boss down, they hadn't managed to knock him out. And with Merlino's track record, the streets of South Philly were likely to hear his name again. After the trial, with Joey Merlino still behind bars, Joe Legambi quietly took the reins of the Philadelphia crime family as acting boss. Legambi, a veteran in the mafia world, set about rebuilding the shattered organization that had been left in disarray after years of internal turmoil and high-profile arrests. Unlike the brash and attention-seeking Merlino, Legambi preferred a low-key approach, focusing on restoring stability rather than making headlines. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. He gained the backing of New York's powerful Gambino and Genovese crime families, further solidifying his position as the leader of the Philly mob. But while Legambi was carefully steering the family back to some semblance of normalcy, Merlino's troubles were far from over. Despite his acquittal on several charges, the government wasn't ready to give up its pursuit of Skinny Joey. Prosecutors were determined to convict him for the murder of Newark soldier Joe Sodano, an execution they believed Merlino had ordered. This time, they thought they had a stronger case, having secured the cooperation of Pete the Crumb Caprio, the very man Merlino had allegedly tasked with carrying out the hit on Sodano. Caprio, along with Ralph Natale, both testified against Merlino, painting him as the mastermind behind the murder. But in a repeat of his earlier court victories, Merlino managed to beat the charges once again. On March 8, 2004, the jury acquitted him of Sodano's murder, dealing another blow to the government's case. Always one for theatrics, Merlino couldn't resist taking a jab at the media frenzies surrounding the trial. In a lighthearted moment after the verdict, he quipped to the audience, "Poor Martha Stewart, my heart breaks for her," referring to the media mogul's legal woes at the time. His family, both blood relatives and mob associates, celebrated his acquittal with a huge party, but the victory was bittersweet. Merlino still had to return to federal prison in Texas to finish serving the remainder of his previous sentence. Throughout the 2000s, as Legambi worked to consolidate his hold on the family, questions lingered within law enforcement and media circles about whether he was truly in charge or simply acting as a placeholder for Merlino. Some believed that Joey, even from his prison cell, was still pulling the strings. Legambi's consigliere, George Borghese, was Merlino's nephew and one of his closest allies, further fueling speculation that Joey's influence had not diminished. Although Borghese and Legambi didn't have the closest relationship, many wondered if Borghese was serving as Joey's eyes and ears, ensuring his interests were protected while he was incarcerated. When Borghese was sent to jail himself, Gaten Lucibello, another of Merlino's longtime street crew members, stepped into the consigliere role. In 2007, Legambi had to appoint Marty Angelina, a volatile and unpredictable mobster, as his underboss. It was widely believed that Angelina's appointment was due to his strong ties to Skinny Joey, reinforcing the idea that Merlino's shadow still loomed large over the Philly mob. By the late 2000s, Merlino was serving the remainder of his sentence closer to home, at the Federal Corrections Institute in Terre Haute, Indiana. With little to do but wait out his time, Merlino focused on keeping in shape, lifting weights, and preparing for his eventual release. In 2011, after serving 10 years of his 14-year sentence, he finally got his chance at parole. Upon his release in 2011, Merlino made a surprising move. Rather than returning to the streets of South Philadelphia, he relocated to the sunny shores of Boca Raton, Florida. In interviews following his release, including a notable one with journalist George Anastasia in 2013, Merlino publicly distanced himself from his criminal past. He claimed he was no longer involved in the Philadelphia Mafia, emphasizing that his days as a mobster were over. "I want no part of that," he said, pointing to the overwhelming number of rats in the criminal world. It seemed Merlino had turned a new leaf, or at least, that's what he wanted the public to believe. In November 2014, Merlino made headlines again, but this time it wasn't for a criminal enterprise. He opened a restaurant in Boca Raton, fittingly named Merlino's, which featured recipes from his mother's kitchen. The restaurant wasn't owned by Joey directly, Due to his criminal record, he was prohibited from owning an establishment that served alcohol, but he worked there as a maitre d', greeting guests and ensuring smooth operations. Despite its novelty and Merlino's infamous reputation, the restaurant closed its doors in 2016, marking the end of Merlino's brief venture into the culinary world. In another twist of fate, Joey Merlino found himself banned from all casinos in Pennsylvania on September 7, 2016, by the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board. This ban seemed to cement his ongoing struggles with law enforcement, who remained wary of his activities even after his public declarations of leaving the mob behind. Though his criminal empire may have been diminished, Joey Merlino's ability to capture attention, whether in the courtroom, the underworld, or the world of fine dining, remained as strong as ever. In 2015, Joey Merlino tried his hand at something new, opening Merlino's Italian restaurant in Boca Raton, Florida, a venture that seemed like a fresh start for the infamous South Philly mobster. The restaurant, serving up his mother's cherished recipes, was a departure from his criminal past, or at least it appeared to be. Despite the buzz and curiosity surrounding the venture, it was short-lived, closing its doors in 2016. But Merlino's attempt to go straight didn't keep him out of the spotlight for long. That same year, on August 4th, Merlino's name would once again be splashed across headlines for much darker reasons. On that day, Merlino became one of 46 people arrested in a sweeping RICO indictment that stretched from Florida to New York, ensnaring criminals up and down the East Coast. Federal agents stormed his Florida home, and Merlino was soon on his way to New York City to face charges. He was accused of being involved in illegal business dealings with members of New York's notorious Genovese crime family. In addition to allegations of racketeering and illegal gambling, Merlino was accused of participating in a massive healthcare fraud scheme in Florida, where doctors were said to have prescribed unnecessary and ineffective medical products, then billed patients' insurance companies for the worthless treatments. Merlino faced a serious legal battle, but he was released on a staggering $5 million bond just 8 days after his arrest. Unlike the other 45 defendants in the case, who quickly accepted plea deals and lighter sentences, Merlino wasn't one to take the easy way out. Stubborn and proud, he refused to plead guilty to any charges and insisted on going to trial, setting the stage for yet another dramatic courtroom showdown. The trial began on January 30, 2018, and lasted 2 weeks, filled with witness testimonies and government allegations. However, on February 20th, Merlino was acquitted of all 4 charges by Judge Richard J. Sullivan, a surprising victory for the embattled mobster. But the legal saga wasn't over yet. To avoid a potentially costly and time-consuming retrial, Merlino made a surprising move in April 2018, cutting a deal with federal prosecutors. In exchange for the U.S. Attorney's Office dropping the remaining charges, Merlino agreed to plead guilty to a single count, facilitating illegal gambling transactions via an electronic device. As part of the deal, prosecutors recommended a prison sentence of 10 to 16 months. However, in October 2018, a judge handed down the maximum sentence of 2 years, sending Merlino back to prison. Even then, fate seemed to be on his side, as he was granted early release in October 2019, finishing his sentence at a halfway house. Upon his release, Merlino returned to South Florida, where he began to cultivate a new, more public-facing persona, focusing on philanthropic efforts and keeping a low profile, at least for a while. But true to form, Merlino's knack for grabbing headlines hadn't completely disappeared. In January 2023, the former mob boss re-emerged in the public eye after a photo surfaced of him alongside former U.S. President Donald Trump at a Trump-owned golf club. Both men flashed a thumbs up in the photo, fueling media speculation and reigniting public interest in Merlino's life. By September 2023, Merlino had pivoted to a more modern venture, launching a sports betting podcast titled The Skinny with Joey Merlino. Every week, the ex-mobster offered football picks, using his newfound platform to engage with fans and build a following as a social media personality. Yet, this move into the public spotlight did not sit well with the Philadelphia Mafia. Merlino's high visibility and media-friendly persona ultimately led to his downfall within the criminal organization. In a rare turn of events, Merlino was reportedly put on a shelf by the Philly family in 2024, a mafia term for being excommunicated or demoted without breaking the code of omerta. It was an unprecedented move in East Coast mob history, as it marked the first time a mafia boss had been banished without committing the ultimate sin of snitching. George Borghese, a former ally and powerful figure within the family, took over as the new boss. Despite his falling out with the mafia, Merlino wasn't done with entrepreneurship. In early 2024, he opened Skinny Joey's Cheesesteaks in South Philadelphia, a homage to the city's iconic sandwich. But even this new venture couldn't escape the drama that had followed Merlino for decades. On May 23, 2024, the restaurant suffered minor damage in a firebombing. Several Molotov cocktails were found at the scene, a stark reminder that even as he tried to distance himself from his criminal past, violence and retribution seemed to linger in Merlino's world. Now, living in a complex web of public persona, business ventures, and mob history, Joey Merlino continues to walk the tightrope between his past as an infamous gangster and his present as a semi-celebrity with one foot in the legitimate world, though it's clear that, for Merlino, his story is far from over.